fasted and bringing in no calories at all. And so the idea behind fat fasting is that fat is really the only macronutrient that doesn't increase insulin really at all. Of course, a huge, massive bolus of fat would likely increase insulin a little bit. But as the macronutrients go, fat really does not bump up insulin much at all. And we know that if insulin is not elevated, then we are essentially in a fasted state, because breaking a fast really is about increasing mTOR and increasing building in our body, which obviously requires insulin. And in order to achieve a higher mTOR state, we require higher blood glucose levels and we require high insulin levels. So theoretically, if you only consume the macronutrient that won't raise your glucose and won't raise your insulin levels, you're effectively in a fasted state. And what's interesting about the select few studies that have looked at fat fasting, they have found that all the positive things that you would get from being in a fasted state, like increased ketone levels, and of course, reduced inflammation, increased cognitive capacity, neuroinflammation is, shown to be brought down, and obviously feeding the gut lining and all the other benefits that ketones have still show to be achievable even when you're consuming some calories via fat. And so this is where fat fasting can be useful. I'm also a fan of fat fasting for people who are trying to regulate their central nervous system. Some people find, not all, but some people find that their stress hormones might elevate when they are in a fasted state. They might see that their cortisol levels rise. And this could be because their body is trying to, it's trying to go through a process called gluconeogenesis, where if your body's glucose levels drop and your body goes, oh, we need to have blood glucose, we need to get more into the bloodstream. So it will create its own glucose via something called gluconeogenesis, which occurs in the liver. And so what can happen when we go through gluconeogenesis is, of course, in order to do this, we require a bit of cortisol. So some people find that if they are in a really low glucose state and they're trying to rely only on their body fat tissue, especially if they're extra lean, they may find that their stress hormones elevate more than what is ideal. So what I find is that if people were to actually consume some caloric intake via fat, it tends to actually calm that central nervous system stimulation that you might have got if you didn't consume anything at all. And certainly I find that certain times within my cycle, I require a bit of fat in fasting more than others. And what I can see is that in the latter half of my cycle, I don't tend to really fast much at all, to be honest, because I'm trying to, bring up my progesterone levels and trying to support my progesterone. And progesterone doesn't do very well when we're doing a lot of fasting. But I do find that as I'm edging towards that end of my cycle, around, just before the last week of my cycle, I find that if I am doing any fasting, I tend to hone in a little bit more into fat fasting so that I can help with just calming the central nervous system and calming the hypothalamus so that we don't get elevated stress hormone levels when we're fasting. And of course, one benefit that people do find as well with fat fasting is if you're bringing in some fuel, it tends to really help to switch off those hunger levels even more so than if you were doing just water fasting. So that can be beneficial for some people in helping to just elongate is probably a better word, to elongate their fast longer than they would have been able to go if they were only doing water fasting. So if it gives you, that extra little bit of a few hours more than you would have got with just water fasting, then certainly I think it can be quite useful to get more of the benefits of fasting. And from what I can see in the literature that I have read, and from the people that I've spoken to when they are looking at blood glucose levels and things like that, it does tend to be that in most, if you consume some calories via fat, you still tend to be getting the wonderful benefits of being in a fasted state, even if you are consuming some calories. But the key here is that your insulin levels are kept baseline and your blood glucose levels are continuously kept stable and low. The other type of fasting that I use quite frequently is water fasting, which essentially just means that you're not consuming any calories at all, but you are consuming obviously water. And actually for me, I find that electrolytes, so putting either just a bit of salt, good quality salt in my water, or using something like Element throughout the day. But that's all I'm consuming throughout the day. The reason I find this useful is because there is something called oxidative priority that I have been fascinated by for many, many years. And it's really just understanding the way that our body uses fuels and what order it's more likely to use them in. Now, this is not a black and white, hard and fast rule for everybody as exactly the same we're using this fuel right now, and then at this point we're suddenly using this fuel. It's not like that. It's much more organic and much more of a flow than that. But there certainly is an oxidative priority. And what we find is that when it comes to fats, for example, your body is going to, if it's going to tap into what you have as a fuel source, so for example, let's say body fat versus the fat that you've just consumed, the body is going to prioritize the fat you've just consumed before body fat. That's just because it's easier and it doesn't have to do as many processes in order to get there. It doesn't take as much energy to be able to access the fuel you've just eaten, the fat you've just eaten, versus the fuel on your body. And so if we were to be in a fasted state, for example, and then you were to consume some fat, the body is going to prioritize breaking through and using that as energy first, the fat that you've just eaten, before it accesses your body fat tissue. So if you're somebody who is very much concerned about, losing body fat, then it would make sense that if you keep interrupting your body's capacity to be able to use its own fat store that you've already stored, then of course you may not get the same fat loss. You may not experience the same amount of fat loss as if you were to just go straight into using your own body fat. I hope that makes sense. So the idea behind obviously water fasting is that you are not interrupting that flow. You are only able to access what you have on your body. And so, as I said, I use water fasting at certain times really of my cycle, and I find that works better at the earlier end of my cycle, if that makes sense. So when I've just got my period, this is when I would utilize water fasting. That works a lot better because your estrogen and your progesterone levels are pretty low at this point. And then as your estrogen rises, estrogen actually does better when you are producing a lot of ketones and you're in a more fasted state than, for example, progesterone. So I find that in the first half of my cycle, I work really, really well utilizing water fasting as opposed to fat fasting, and then vice versa. At the end of the cycle, I find that fat fasting is better. But just to reiterate, in that last week before I get my period, I don't fast at all. So as I said, when you're doing water fasting, you might find it useful to actually utilize some electrolytes, certainly because when we are producing more ketones, we're breaking more tissue down and we're excreting it from the body. You may find that you're peeing a lot more, and this is where people will lose a lot of their electrolytes. So if you're starting to feel like a little bit, your brain's not firing as quickly as you want it to be, you're feeling a bit like, I feel gross, this is where you may not be getting enough electrolytes when you're fasting. So certainly try that and see if that helps. One other note that I didn't touch on with the fat fasting is I guess you could call utilizing exogenous ketones as fat fasting, because as you know, ketones are a fuel source. And if you're bringing in exogenous ketones, which is from a supplement as opposed to making it yourself, you're effectively doing fat fasting. The cool thing about ketones and exogenous ketones is, of course, again, they're a type of fat, and they are not going to raise your insulin levels, and they're certainly not going to raise your blood glucose levels. So you can be consuming this calorie-dense energy fuel. I don't know if you can really call it a calorie dense, but it's a fuel source. So you can be bringing that in and essentially calming your central nervous system, bringing in a fuel source without actually getting out of being in a fasted state. So you're still considered fasting by using exogenous ketones. But again, I will remind you that just like any other fuel source, if you bring in a fuel source exogenously that you're not producing in your own body, you're of course interrupting the oxidative priority. So you could effectively be stalling your ability to burn body fat while your body is breaking down that exogenous fuel source. Now, there are some gray areas around this, and certainly everybody would be a bit different. I have seen people talking about the fact that potentially because your insulin is so low, you could be, burning a mixture. And I would say this would make sense. Biochemically, you're not going to be, like I said, burning only what you've just eaten and then suddenly burning only body fat. It's always going to be a mixture like there is with any macronutrient. You're not ever going to be just burning glucose or fat.